Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 19, season 2. I have a very dear episode to my heart today with Susana Lein of Salamander Springs. Susana is a good friend of mine, and I've known her for, almost 10 years now. And like anyone who knows Susana or knows her farm, I've been incredibly inspired by her work that entire time. She was one of the first people to show me the potential in no-till on any sort of scale, and I really love her work. And today we're going to talk about some of that work, about the permaculture paradise she sort of carved out for herself in the mountains of Appalachia, her sort of Fukuoka-inspired no-till system of sort of broadcasted cash crops into cover crops, and a whole lot more. Susana is a wealth of knowledge, and I just love chatting with her. And so I'm excited to get to share one of those conversations with you. And of course, I could not do it without the help of our show sponsors, like Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software makes it easier for your farm to manage working with your buyers. By lessening the administrative load and increasing efficiency, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, and work with more buyers overall. Our free account includes features to manage your real-time and coming soon product availability, and tools to create your own availability calendar to inform buyers on the seasonality of your products. The free account also includes access to the Farmers Web Guide to Working with Wholesale Buyers, which offers pro tips and best practices on how to work with restaurants, schools, and other similar buyers. A 1-month free trial is available of the paid account, which includes features to manage your customers and orders, give select buyers special pricing and payment terms, track your buyers' payments, send invoices, keep detailed sales records, and much more. You can even manage orders for buyers who don't place them online. Access a demo video and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Also, this episode is generously supported by Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School.
Hi everyone, this is Keisha from the Soil Food Web School. I just wanted to remind you all that you only have until midnight on Sunday, January 12th to take advantage of the special introductory offer of 32% off the Soil Food Web Foundation courses. As you may know, Dr. Ingham is considered by many to be the world's foremost soil biologist. She spent the last 4 decades pioneering research on how plants and microbes work together. Dr. Ingham has helped farmers around the world to reduce their chemical inputs and to simultaneously increase their yields and profits by optimizing their soil biology. I've personally trained with Dr. Ingham, and now I run a successful business helping farmers to grow food in harmony with nature. The all-new Soil Food Web Foundation courses are available now with an amazing $1,600 off for the first 150 students who register. If you'd like to join the soil revolution, then please go to www.soilfoodweb.com today and click the button right at the top of the page.
Big thank you to our show sponsors, and I actually owe another big thank you to Matt from Grow Appalachia for getting Susana set up on Skype so we could chat. Susana is very off-grid, so it took a little bit of coordination, and Matt made it happen. So check out Grow Appalachia. They've built all of our high tunnels here at our farm. That's growappalachia.berea.edu. We'll put a link in the show notes. All right, enough from me. Let's get to our show with Susana Lein of Salamander Springs. Susana Lein, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jesse. It's such a treat to be on, and I really appreciate your persistence in making this happen. Also, just want to give a shout out to Grow Appalachia for providing the Skype and internet and all that to bring this off-gridder into town.
That's so great. And yeah, absolutely. Huge shout out to Grow Appalachia. They're doing such great work, and we love what they do, and we really appreciate them setting this up. So, speaking of off-grid, let's just start there. So I'm super excited to have you on to kind of talk about your farm. So maybe you can just kind of give the listeners an idea of where you're located and just kind of a little bit of information about your farm.
Yes, I am south of Berea, Kentucky, which people may know. Berea's from, as in Berea College, and it's kind of known for arts and crafts and music and such. But I am up into the mountains more, actually surrounded by Daniel Boone National Forest. It's the foothills of the Appalachian region here on the Kentucky side. And so I bought, a quarter of 98 acres, about 24, mostly forested. Like I said, I'm surrounded by national forest as well. So this is basically not farmland. This was reclaiming an overgrown meadow, which after logging was run for many, many years by hogs. That was a tradition here in Appalachia to fatten them originally on chestnuts. And so that was what I cleared. It was mostly cedars and locust trees, not old, like I didn't take out old growth. There is some older growth. I'm blessed to have a lot of products from the forest as well, like ramps and medicinals and mushrooms. And so the farm is quite different than a lot of market farms, that's for sure.
It's funny. I was thinking when you said Berea, I think of Berea as really well known for its pottery because of the clay that can be found around there. Is that indicative of what your soil is like?
Yeah, my soil, there was no topsoil, partly because it was, like I said, overrun with hogs. A friend of mine was doing pottery, and where I dug one of my first ponds, which began to be, it was the Greywater system for when I built my little house. And so that pond, it showed me that I didn't really need to worry about sealing anything off because and so that also gets into why tillage. I was already on the path of no tillage with permaculture and learning, to imitate natural systems and tried to take that into farming. But there wasn't anything to even break ground in the beginning with. People often talk about, well, I can till and then stop. But it all was building up basically off of shaly, silty clay.
I'm curious, and I don't know if I've ever asked you this question, but where did permaculture sort of come into your life?
That's a great question. I kind of have to step back a little bit, not all the way back, but it was during the years I was working in Boston and really frustrated. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, but went to college during that era of transition, really. It was still in school when Reagan came in, but he took the solar panels off the White House, and there was still an idealism in me from my education that I would be designing more sustainable developments. What I ended up doing in Boston basically was huge office parks and paving over, doing cookie cutter condominium developments. I was quite frustrated with not really why, I wanted to be working. And my idealism really was dampered and during the 80s. And I started going to a place, which actually you had friends of mine on this podcast who also started at the New Alchemy Institute on Cape Cod. Ricky, I want to give a shout out to, and I think you interviewed, and I would love to hear this interview, but you interviewed he and his wife, Debbie. And so that was an escape for me, literally. One of the people that I first saw there was Helen Nearing, who was still speaking. Helen and Scott Nearing were some of the books that I was reading about the Back to the Lander movement in the early part of the century. And as you probably know, Elliot Coleman bought land from them, and that's where he started. So anyway, I learned about permaculture there during the 80s. It was just coming over from Australia. And so that kind of opened my mind. Certainly, I didn't think I would be going back into farming. I ended up leaving the country for pretty much the decade of the 90s. So that's a whole nother story. But, I worked in permaculture in Latin America. I did a lot of building of appropriate technologies, solar showers, and early version of the rocket stove, that type of thing. And then eventually, long story, but moving back to the U.S. was a kind of a scary proposition for me. But I also really decided that I wanted to live in solidarity with most of the world and make my living from the farm, and actually probably did that in a stronger sense than otherwise, because here I am on a ridge top, which is where most of the world has to produce their food, is on less than ideal land.
Interesting. So when you were in Latin America and you were kind of picking up some of these sort of permaculture principles, was that were they doing the permaculture principles on purpose, or was that just kind of something that they were doing as a lifestyle?
Yes, yes. So the transition, what happened is I ended up working with a nonprofit in Guatemala. I did projects in other Nicaragua and Ecuador as well, but Guatemala, Altertech, Alternative Technology, was an offshoot of a place you may have heard of called the Aprovecho Institute in Oregon. So I was working, like I said, in appropriate technologies as well, which is what they were focused on, and permaculture. We did campesino, which is small farmer trainings, in a very different way of teaching permaculture. But it really, to be quite honest, it worked so well with what farmers traditionally were doing and what they understood. I mean, I think it fit like a glove. And so I learned as much as I taught, and I learned so much. I think I've talked to you about, the cornmeal corn Three Sisters system, which actually they don't call it there, but the polyculture system of corn, and also selecting and developing corn. I learned from the people who actually developed corn from teosinte, which is the size of a wheat. So I just was so blessed to have those years of learning.
Can you elaborate a little bit now while we're talking about this, because that's really fascinating to me, about the Three Sisters thing? Can you talk a little bit about maybe like popular understanding of Three Sisters versus how they implement it, and then maybe describe a little bit about how they implement Three Sisters?
Yeah, I think, of course, my experience is based on Alta Verapaz, where I lived, and the Pocumchi people where I live. So I think that some of what I hear, and of course, not being up on the internet, you get a lot more of these ideas of course, Native American, North American Three Sisters as well. But I often hear about hills. And practically speaking, to feed a family, people didn't really do that in Latin America. It was a field in the sense that I knew a field. I have a very tall, strong corn, and of course the plants are a foot apart, but they are in rows. And I picked the beans, which are a string bean and Appalachian heirloom beans that I grow in the field, are harvested off of that tall corn. It provides the steak. And that was the case also in Guatemala. But you'd have chilies, you'd have avocado trees, you had a lot more. You had hierbas, herbs, greens that naturally grew, that at the beginning I thought were weeds that they were just leaving there because they are related to what we would call weeds, pigweed and amaranth and lamb's quarters, which is also very close to quinoa. So all of those things were part of the field. And the squash was important to cover the field, to keep the weeds out at the end of the season. It really took over, especially and that's true of what I do here too. It takes over for my rye cover crop, which breaks down by the end of the season. So it really is moisture trapping and weed suppressing, especially the very vigorous squashes, which in Appalachia are some very vigorous ones that really do a great job of covering that field over by the time the season's over and producing a lot, more than I can sell.
Yeah, that's amazing. So maybe we could talk a little bit about your sort of intensive annual production that you've done. I know you're transitioning away from that a little bit, but maybe we could talk about how you run those systems. Can you kind of dive into that a little bit for us? Maybe starting with the cover crop if you want.
Yeah, so the cover crop really has been for quite a long time an important part of my system in the staple crop productions. We haven't talked about the beans, the dry beans. Also, I was addicted to black beans when I moved back because that's what I ate every single day in Latin America. So I wanted to grow those, and I also grow pintos because that's kind of the traditional soup bean in this Appalachian region. So those two things and the cornfield eventually, although the cornfield was a really mulch space at the beginning because I didn't really, I had the squash covering at the beginning, but I did put a lot of cut and carry and bring in hay at those early years because I didn't have that system developed. But I really credit Masanobu Fukuyoko's book for getting me into it. I was like, I could maybe do this rice and barley and clover system with dry beans. And I kind of laughed at myself because I grew up in a Midwestern farm where, of course, you have to plant the beans into the soil. You can't just broadcast them. But it has worked better and better every year, and it's not something I question anymore. I broadcast so even on my market beds. So to speak about the market beds, they were very mulch spaced at the beginning. I set out the permanent market beds with cardboard. I call it a layer cake system. It was quite simple. I do make a lot of compost because I'm blessed with a lot of corn stalks that naturally aerate the pile. They're also a lot of work, but that's a great way to get an aerobic compost and carbon into your pile. But I also just used a lot of manure. I laid manure on cardboard. It's a very thick cardboard in those early years because when I was clearing the land, I still had stumps of locusts, and people in this region know what a locust will never let go. It's a wonderful pioneer species. It's fixing nitrogen. It's a great, post that I use for construction, rot resistant, but it is also tenacious. So I remember back to those years when I had very, very thin soil and I laid down 6 inches of manure because I wasn't using those beds till the year following. I was still working outside when I started camping on the land and building those beds. So I had time. I was working construction, and probably one of the mistakes I did is to start trying to make my living off the land before I even had a tiny house finished on my land. So I've been doing it piecemeal ever since, very small scale.
Okay, so you have the cardboard down and then the manure.
Yeah. So what I did for the most part on the beds, and a very important part of laying out the beds has been for me to have them dead level, contour swales across the field, and then contour swales, which are also the paths on every single bed. And I know you and I have talked about how I do use wood chips on the paths, but when they are dead level, you have to make sure they are, then you don't get that erosion because water sinks and slows down. And that's a really hard thing for people to understand, is that any little bit of slope is going to wash. Water will find its way down. So that has been important. And the wood chips don't wash off for me, but they also are the way that those paths, the beds now are raised. They were raised a tiny bit in the beginning, but over time, with the addition of compost as I plant or cover crops broken down or mulch, over time they become raised, and the paths only get the wood chips, which actually get when they break down, get thrown up on the beds as well. So they are truly contour swales. They're lower than the bed above, below them. And so that means that after a big rain, the nutrients captured by the water, which fills up, I might be in rubber boots walking in those paths, but the day after that water has not hit the creek down on the road. It has stayed on my land, and that's a very important thing. It's a permaculture principle that I think farmers can really benefit from, because it really takes an understanding of how it works. And there's definitely, with our extremes, I think everywhere, but Jesse, what we've had here, like just incredible rain over like 100-year rains every year, 100-year flooding rain. So we do have to have places for that water to go, which means diversion into ponds. And, I do have small ponds. The higher on the site, the better, storing the water. I should also mention that I don't have irrigation, and I'm totally off grid. I built a spring box, which is very limited water storage. 600 gallons is what I have up there in the forest. So, I also have small rainwater catchments off of a very tiny house and tiny other buildings that I've built, but that's it. So this is also important for that reason. I know that wasn't what you were first asking me, and I'm sorry, but the cardboard was very important at the beginning. It's not something that I've done very much since then. Once the beds are built, they are. If you keep cover crop or mulch in the early years, I had to do more work because I didn't. Now I like the rye that is so important in my field. And I just can't believe that all these years I didn't do tomatoes and peppers and with the rye cover crop makes such a massive mulch that it lasts, well into the season, and I might sow buckwheat into it. Not having to cut and carry from my pasture area, which is a big part of the area that I cleared. I call it the pasture. It's had mostly geese and ducks, and I haven't had larger animals, but the cut and carry aspect is great in that you do get supplemental mulch off your own land, but the labor involved made me really over time understand how I could use the very same principles of diverse cover crops that natural way of farming and Masanobu Fukuoka was talking about on the beds. So the rye and wheat as well, which was the early cover crop I used before I understood how I could use rye in the field, and buckwheat. I mean, there's a diverse cocktail mix that I've used over the years, but the predominant carbon contribution in the winter is rye or wheat, millet more in the summer, and then oats in the intermediary if it winter kills. So those are really, really important for me to grow my mulch in place. And I've learned actually in the last I would say the last 8 years to use that more and more on more crops. I mean, there's certain crops that, of course, I use the compost and just, cover that over when I take a crop off, like broadcasting greens, for example. But there's other crops that, I think when you were out with the event, I had the remnants of buckwheat that was surrounding like later crops of squash, zucchini, and summer squash and cucumbers. That diversity has helped me with pests as well. It's, a balance between all, the permaculture to me in the early years was just a little bit crazy for market farming. I feel like I had to take those principles in a lot of things, especially in the nut and fruit tree and food forest ideas, and take the best of that and imitating nature, but make it accessible to efficiency and production for market farming. And that's been my challenge over the years. And I think that, the cover crops have been so important. It's allowed me to produce. People are always saying how I can't believe how much you can produce on such a small area. I have a lot of land, but every single bit of it had to be improved. So, and it's not farmland. So those cover crops are a big piece of that, of allowing the soil to never be tilled, and to learn how to do that. Also, it was important in perennial production is a big part of what I do now, and I know that's getting off track, and we can talk about that later. But all of those aspects of permaculture that people learn can be applied. The principles can be applied in a way that works for production, I think. And so I think that's the challenge. And that's why I really, really am very appreciative of what you're doing, is because you're taking it out there to people who want to build, produce for a community, which I think is where permaculture over the years has lacked. And when I was first teaching at Farmers Conference, I wouldn't even use the word permaculture because people have an impression that it's just not practical. And there's so much to learn as organic farmers. But if you take what people experiment with and then apply it to your own situation, I think there's a lot. That's the best thing, is to just, that's what you're allowing people to do, is to take the best of their own situation. And
I agree that there's this sort of people really love a lot of the permaculture principles, but they're trying to implement them into more maybe economically viable systems as well. So it's this kind of push and pull between figuring out how to do enough of those systems, but also make it reasonable for production agriculture. Hey, you all, quick interruption from me. If you appreciate this show or any of the shows we do, please consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/farmerjesse. It is not super easy for me to plug that every week, but without that Patreon page, we can't do this show. We can't do the YouTube channel and no-till growers and all the stuff that we do to kind of aggregate all this no-till information. It's just expensive. It's super time-consuming. There's a lot of different monthly bills that we have to pay. So if it's valuable to you, if you take value from it and you have a couple extra bucks every month, consider chipping in. That's patreon.com/farmerjesse. If you have a friend or family member who is not a farmer but would love to support this kind of work for you or for the future of agriculture, shoot them the link. Patreon.com/farmerjesse. Share it on your Facebook. Say, hey, please support this page. It's important. That's huge for us. There are discounts to merch and events. You get first dibs on asking questions of certain guests. And at certain levels, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout out this week to Adam Hensley, Bob and Ann Patton, Christopher Brown, C. Max Small, Dakota S. Jernigan, David Williams, Eric Schlellner, Esoterra Culinary, Grant Timms, Jared Kirst, Jay Armour, Jay McCombs, J.M. Fortier, Jeffrey Hayes, Kevin Keene, Christine Albrecht, Mark Andrew Giroux, Mike Dillon, Mike Garcia, Pandora, Ryan Gosser, Seeds of Solitude, Terry Barr, Tiffany Jackson, Tim Baldwin, Weaver Akers, William Henpen, and Yannick LaPlante. All right. Thank you to all of our show supporters, and thank you for thinking about it. Patreon.com/farmerjesse. Back to Susana. Okay, so you have those beds. Let's say we're in the springtime, and you have kind of two main fields that you use for your corn and your beans. Can you describe, like, once that cover crop is up, what sort of the next step is?
Yes, I think I've mentioned to you, and you have a link, Jesse, which you probably can share with your listeners, that would be really helpful for people who want to get into more staple crops. The dry bean system, especially Cornell had a bunch of us several years back on a panel for minimum till, and they wrote an article in their Small Farms Quarterly about my system in Kentucky and how they could adapt it to the Northeast. And I think having that link would be really helpful for people. Even with me, Actually, and I also will say that even though I'm totally off grid, a friend has made a website, which that link is on there too. So if you share that, there's lots of pictures of my PowerPoint slides when I teach that give this rundown. Very a picture is worth 1,000 words. So like the PowerPoint slides have lots of pictures with the information going through the season. But let me start with right now, because that's what's out there. It's a field. Well, I feel so blessed after the severe drought we had that we got a rain to get a really good stand of rye cover crop. And I'm using rye predominantly now. I don't use wheat nearly as much for the cornfield and for the bean field. And when I say rye, it's a diverse mix. I have Austrian winter pea, I have crimson clover, I have brassicas, which some of the brassicas were earlier. I can get into the section that's in oats later because that goes in August and not in October. Ideally October. I've done rye as late as November. But so anyway, the stand of rye mixed with a lot of other, the nitrogen fixers and whatnot is growing through the winter, obviously. And in the spring, if you try to get in there too early, you're going to fight. It's just like any other grass. It'll just come back if you try to take it down. So you really have to know that the rye is not going to be the mulch that you want it unless you wait till the seed milk stage. And you probably, I know that you had Daniel Firth, who, I'm sure other people have talked about this. So that's very important before you crimp it. If you have mechanization to crimp, my crimper is now a pallet, a really heavy pallet. I, for many years, scythed, and I love scything, but I have really learned that, man, laying that rye flat in the same direction has made it even better. It's a lot easier. So unfortunately, I'm not scything as much, and I love teaching people to scythe, but I use a really high-tech crimper, which is a heavy oak pallet, and I am the oxen, and I drag it. This is a 3/4 acre field, so my scale on my mountain doesn't really justify tractors. It's not that I'm against them. I think we can have electric driven tractors and horses and doing the same thing, but crimping rye has been a game changer for me. It's made it really less weed pressure by the time the beans take over. So what I do with the beans and what I do with the corn are very different. And like I said, the Cornell article is really going to give you this in a pictorial way because they took a lot of my pictures. So the rye is standing. And like I said, it has to be at the milk stage. It can still be green, obviously. And actually, I can wait until it's almost dead standing straw. I don't worry like some people do about rye reseeding because I want it to be there the next fall, and it's too hot in the summer for it to thrive anyway. So that's not an issue for me. So that was the game changer for me too, is that I don't have to the scything had to be at a certain stage. If that starts falling over like dead straw, it's a little hard to scythe. So that allowed me to do it over time. And so I lay it flat after I sow the beans or the cowpeas and into the field. I can get into the chicken system, which I had as well. It's quite complex, but the really simple aspect of it is you sow into a standing cover crop and then lay it down. And of course, you have to know, the crimson clover luckily matures similar time. It works well. The early years when I used wheat and had vetch, I still have vetch out there, weedy, and it doesn't die at the right time. And I was scything and it would tangle my scythe. So I kind of dislike vetch. It's a great nitrogen fixer, fixes as much probably nitrogen as crimson clover, but it's not for my system. So that with rye was more difficult, which is why for many, many years I used wheat on the bean field, because wheat only gets up to my hips and I can sow the whole darn field with the beans and then scythe it down. Well, rye is very tall. It's lovely. You get so much biomass. But how do you do that? I can't sow above that. I'm not tall enough. So I did sections at a time. And basically, my sections I could sow about 12 to 15 feet across. I love teaching when I do permaculture workshops a lot more now on the farm, and I love teaching people to sow. And it's basically 12 to 15 feet that you can get across a section. You put some tobacco or stakes of some kind out there so you know where you've done, and you just keep moving. But what you have to do with the rye is take that part down before you can move over, because it's too tall, if it makes sense. So that's it in a nutshell on the I don't know if I've forgotten anything, but on the bean field, I think that there's a lot of details with later crops. I've experimented with many things over the years. Sorghum Sudan, of course, doesn't work very well in my system, but the chickens also love, they actually like broomcorn sorghum better for the grain. So that sometimes is mixed in. I did a lot of experimenting with different cover crops, but the predominant carbonaceous crop that provides the mulch is rye now.
That's great. So just so I make sure I have it, you have the rye is getting ready to be oxened down with your pallet. And you sow the beans. You sow the beans, and then you push the rye down, crimp it down, and then the beans are going to come up through that rye.
Exactly.
And these are pretty much a bush bean, like you're not having to put out.
So yes, the pinto still has a bit of vininess in it, and I can get into I do have I have two fields. I grow heirloom cornmeal corn that I've developed. I sell the seed for it. Something I'd love to talk about too. And then popcorn, which is open pollinated. I save the seed, save a lot of seed, but that's something I don't sell, but I still need those two corns to be separate. So those two fields are treated very differently, and I could get into that nuance as well. But the bean field, yes, is much more simple in that it is. I mean, I have cowpeas which have provided forage for chickens and a later rotation. So as I've cut back on that bean field, the cowpeas have been some for me, some for saving seed, and some for chicken forage, and they can be put in later than May. So the chickens are in there. They like wheat better, so that section might be wheat that they move through a section that last year was black beans, and then they take that down, and they are very viney. They're like kudzu vine. They take over, and they are wonderful in that the black beans and the pintos are much more like a field bean, especially black bean. And I was starting to say that the popcorn has provided a place for the pinto beans as well, because they're somewhat viney. I have more issues with moisture years in the fall with pinto beans because they don't stand up. And so I've done things like add more buckwheat to help them stand up like a field bean should. But I also love planting them as my three sisters on popcorn, just as an extra, because I can't do anything else on the popcorn. It's too short. The three sisters that we mentioned before really works well with a tall heirloom bean that we have here. The heirlooms are all very vigorous. Even the half runner, which I tried on popcorn, is too much for popcorn or sweet corn. That's something else I should mention, is a lot of people understand this three sisters but forget that it really doesn't work for many reasons on sweet corn. It's too short, it's too weak. You're going to be wanting to walk out there and stomping all over your squash vines to harvest sweet corn at an immature stage instead of at a dry stage at the end of the season.
Right.
So I've answered your question, hopefully with a lot of other nuances.
Oh, no, absolutely. Okay, so with the one thing that you have said, and that I didn't realize until I brought Daniel Mays and Stephen Cornett and Steve Larson down there to see it, is that when you say bean field, that is always the bean field. So can you talk a little bit about crop rotation? And then I do want to talk about the corn, but I want to talk about crop rotation first.
Right. And the cornfield's also always the cornfield. So the bean field, one of the advantages of diversity in the bean field, having didn't get into this as much except saying buckwheat with the pinto beans, but having a bit more than just beans out there because it's a monoculture, is that my biggest issue has been Mexican bean beetle. There's predatory wasps that help, and there's but I think that the rotation would be, if I had that, it would be important. And it's amazing that I've had no issues with the corn too, because people are like, how do you don't get corn earworm? And I really credit overall with the market gardens and the staple crops that to soil health. I mean, immunity. I mean, it really doesn't draw them in as much. But when you have a monoculture of beans, you can have those issues. And I have. Some years I haven't had much at all, but there's been a few years that I've had some serious Mexican bean beetle issues, which is like the thing about dry beans is you don't worry so much about the cosmetics as you do with a green bean, right? But you have less, the beans can be affected in their size. So that's a disadvantage to not having farmland to rotate crops. Like it really, when you have no topsoil on most of your land because it's been eroded by logging and hogs, it is truly not farmland. So it's like being in an urban backyard, having a very limited space. So you have to deal with the reality of what space you have. And for that to have worked for me, I know that people would say, oh, you're playing with fire, especially with the corn. And my corn has been amazing. I haven't had any issues with that. But the beans I definitely have. And so rotating away from that, like having one of the things with cutting back this year is I had an area where I could protect it, and I have less, I feel like if I'm doing more teaching consulting, I can take a break from it. So to give them not any food for a year or a season, but definitely the diversity in the cover crop is helping. And so that's something I would love more time to experiment with. I think that, as you know, Jesse, when you're producing for market constantly, you don't have the time for experimentation. And so you just keep doing what works, and you do, like moving more of those things in and having more time to research them. And unfortunately, not having internet, I can't do it the easier way, but those are things I want to learn, because I feel like the system is wonderful, but how to get diversity so that the Mexican bean beetle isn't as attractive. And I've noticed definitely. And the other thing is the chickens. And I could talk about the chickens and the ducks. Had a slug problem this year when I gave my ducks to a friend because I was on the road more. I used to laugh about that, just being a Bill Mollison permaculture, speak, but it really is true. So that is also an aspect. I don't have an answer, but I know it's something that diversity and that includes the animal species. Another thing that I'm working on right now is a rice paddy, which is like I have a rice paddy set up pretty much ready to go. So that also brings in a microclimate. I didn't have ponds down near the bean field. They're up in the market garden area, and they have been so important for pest control. I go into the gardens, and all the frogs are just running for the pond. What are you out here for tonight? You know, they're doing a really important job. Also, you know, there's a lot of predators that like the diversity of fruit and nut and perennials on the farm. It's another thing we could talk about is that, you know, having a lot of diversity. I mean, my crops, this that what I market is diverse because of all the species that are planted. I probably have close to 100 varieties, if not more. I don't even know at this point. I've probably added well over that, but as far as what I sell. So I think all of those things are possibly answers to controlling an issue, but the reality of the production I was doing was a small monoculture, nothing like the conventional farm I grew up on in the Midwest, but it still brings in those issues. And so that's something to learn from.
So I want to hear about how the cornfield differs from the bean field in terms of how you're planting those. Like you said, with the beans, you're kind of broadcasting them, but with the corn, you're kind of going, you're
Yeah.
transplanting, or you're planting direct, you're planting seeds, or how does that work?
I'm planting directly. In fact, I plant in solidarity with the people I learned from. It's I don't have mechanization, Jesse, so I plant a very large field. You don't want to be on your knees, right? So I learned the stick method, which is basically you have to have a good aim, but you dibble stick. And as my soil has become, the tilth has become so soft, dibble sticking into the rye cover crop has been, I don't no problem. I have laid compost. I have thickened that soil over a long time. That the cornfield expanded over time from a very small field that was cardboard, just like the market gardens. As I got chickens, once I closed in my house enough to live on the land full time, I had animals that helped me with that expansion and clearing, you know, land. So yeah, the expansion of the cornfield has really been through animals as well. But the rye and wheat in the early years, cover crops, have been such an important part in the field because of the spacing of a row of corn, even with the squash gradually taking over and the pumpkins that you have out there covering a lot of the land, you really have a lot of work involved in mulching such a field in order to have space to pick your beans. You know, it is a wide spacing. That's why a cornfield takes, you know, quite a bit of room. The polyculture is a wonderful way to make it so much more productive, but having a mulch grown in place has been so important. And this rye cover crop is very similar to what I do on the market beds with tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and later crops that you transplant out in that time of year. Early May is when that rye is ready here in Kentucky. So you have to plan for that when you plant a cover crop on a market bed. So with the corn, I lay it flat first. I used to scythe it, but now I lay it flat. And then like you, we've talked about the weed whacker. I would love to have it run off my small solar electric system and charge it, but right now I just have a gasoline driven one, and I rip a very small furrow in that. I just kind of use it on an angle so that rye is still covering the field. You can see the rip mark if you can imagine what I'm talking about. You don't want to rip too much, so that I leave it on an angle, and that's where I dibble the corn into. There's been years like this last year, we had a weedy time where the lower part of my cornfield had more weeds, and so I laid some extra mulch and leaves there. But the rye cover crop is very thick if you have a great stand. And I'm hoping for that this year because my stand looks great. I mean, unless we get too much rain again like we did last spring, once you lay that flat, it lasts for quite a long time, and the corn comes up through it. And what I have done in the last couple of years also is experiment in places where the squash and pumpkin vines are not growing over. It's not going to be the whole field unless you want to be harvesting squash forever. I mean, it is, you could cover your whole field. I've done that with the popcorn easily, but where I pick beans, I don't want to be stepping over vines too much. So what I do is I sow buckwheat in there as the rye has broken down, I'm going to say in July. And so that becomes the new cover crop. Does okay in the shade of the cornfield, and it kind of gets smashed down by itself. I use buckwheat a lot as an intermediate cover crop. I do on the market beds too. It's quite important. I've been lax in some years of making sure that buckwheat gets slashed at that flower stage so you don't have it self-sowing everywhere. I don't worry about that so much in the bean field for the same reason as I mentioned with the rye. Buckwheat in the field is a great intermediate crop. Another thing I failed to mention on the bean field, Jesse, is that in the early years, I waited after harvest the beans. They come out in August. It's September, the earliest that you can plant rye and wheat in the winter cover crops. There's a long window of at least a month and a half where weeds can grow up because all you have is dry bean vines out there. So buckwheat is an important intermediate crop. And until it gets real late and it's hardly worth it, and I don't think the cowpeas are going to fix any nitrogen for me, they're in there. Brassicas go down with the buckwheat because that way I can harvest. I harvest kale all over the place. My market beds, they're so healthy when they're mixed with everything else. I harvest daikons all over the field. It's really important that they go in August. Another nuance I should probably get into is the popcorn, which actually goes in earlier. I need 1 month between the two cornfields to not cross-pollinate. The popcorn's a shorter season. It's 90 days, whereas the cornmeal corn's 110. So I've got more than a month, but I still don't want them, the tassels to pollinate the dent corn, the cornmeal corn's later. So being a flint corn, popcorn can go in earlier. Flint corn is more common up north. It can take April planting, which is dent corn in the south is generally later. So that means that I don't want to be fighting rye out there in April. It'll just keep growing back. I imagine there's ways you can do it, but it's too time consuming. And a living rye cover crop probably in Kentucky is going to overtake my popcorn. And so I really have learned to use oats, which generally winter kill. And so it's a mulch out there. It's not killed yet. We did have a pretty low temperature already, Jesse, here, but it's still not dead, but it will be by spring. And the crimson clover makes a very nice cover crop between the popcorn rows, and it doesn't overtake it. It's not going to get 6 feet tall and shade out the popcorn. I might whack it back a little bit. So that's another nuance. It gives you a dead mulch out there on the field. It's pretty nice.
Yeah, that's good. With that buckwheat, you're just broadcasting that directly over the beans, right? Is that?
The buckwheat, I'm broadcasting into the breaking down rye into the cornfield. And you mean in the bean field?
I guess either. Just you're just casting it. You're not doing any like raking or anything.
Yeah. So the buckwheat and the pintos get sowed at the same time. Buckwheat, like I said, buckwheat will die, as you know, right when the frost comes, but it also doesn't like the heat as much as beans. So it does well like from May on, like when the pintos especially are growing up. I put less with the black beans because they stand on their own pretty pretty well, but I do buckwheat. I've experimented too with the turnips and the daikons and the kale and the mustard, all those brassicas I put in the mix early, even though they get hot. They don't get as hot because they're shaded with all the diverse cover crops. It stays very cool in the soil. So I've added a lot of different things. The millet has become my summer grass. What else have I experimented with? I'd like to experiment with more of the things. Japanese millet is expensive. I've used more of the foxtail and the German millet. And it does help the beans stand up. So I do buckwheat, to answer your question, in a lot of different ways. I'll throw buckwheat this year with not doing such intensive cropping. Like when I would flip a bed, it would just be, buckwheat. At least I've got living roots on the soil if I'm not planning on putting anything else in there.
Hey, you all. Last interruption from me. Just a quick reminder that I will be in San Diego on Valentine's Day weekend, the 15th of February, for an event there with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right. We will be presenting, all three of us. There will be a field walk to see some new beds that Jared is setting up at the venue. And there will be tacos, which I'm very excited about. Not going to lie. I'm going to drag Josh Satin with us. He's going to film some stuff. We're going to be there, so it's going to be rad. So more info on that event at no-tillgrowers.com. Back to Susana. So I want to get a little technical on one thing that we talked about earlier on in this conversation, and it's the slope and the setting up swales thing. Because you and I have talked about this, but I have a lot of issues on that one side of my new tunnel going downhill where I have a little bit of washout because of the angle. So because water doesn't have anywhere to go, it piles up in the aisles and then it washes over the beds, and that ends up causing, little eroded spots on the beds. And so after seeing some of the swales that you've done at your farm, I'm kind of curious, like, what if you could sort of take us through how to potentially do that in an area like mine. Because you also have some kind of low-tech ways of doing it that are pretty simple.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, the permaculture folks know about A-levels. I used them substantially in Guatemala because people didn't have, the luxury of even a level, let alone a laser level. If you have access to a laser level, it is a lot faster, but I love teaching people with the A level because, it's, as I started my farm with zero money, I had to be building infrastructure as I went. I didn't have money for those kinds of things, and the scale of my farm, and this is probably the scale of where you're talking about on your land, it's very accessible. It's basically an equilateral triangle. And you can cheat here in the US and put a level on that bottom of the triangle. Basically, you're 2 feet on this. You got an equilateral triangle and 2 feet. And they are what they have to be the same length. That's very important. The equilateral triangle and feet the same length. And the way we did it in Guatemala was basically like a plumb bob in construction. It's a string with a weight on it, and the exact center of the bottom leg of the triangle would be what positions those 2 feet to be the same level above sea level, if you would. And that's what you stake out when you start a bed or a path or a swale. I have swale beds across the fields. You've seen those, and then every path between the bed. Important aspect of what you're talking about, because I saw you have a lot of rain. What do I want to say? Pavement is zero infiltration, and also your hoop houses are. So you're getting more rain pressure than just the absorption that your soil is allowing. It's very, very important that you have high organic matter. That's something I haven't gotten into, but my beds, like I've had 18% organic matter on some soil tests. It's less than that now, but I've gone to a place where this, Jesse, I guess, how many 20,000 gallons for every percent organic matter you increase that the soil absorbs it. So of course, wood chips are high organic matter, but if you have a very clay soil like I did underneath that, you're not going to have the paths absorb a lot, right? So, and of course you have living roots in the soil that allows even more absorptions and less runoff. But I think in your situation, you probably need to also think about a place for the water to go when we have our extremes that we're getting these days. Because I've also had to connect to more and make more what I call pocket ponds. And a pocket pond doesn't have to be very big, and it's not something where you want a direct flow. It's where the water can drop, if you understand what I'm saying. It's so the erosion will happen when you have any percent slope, right? So dead level is important, but also a place for the water to drop along the way. So high on the site, have a little microclimate off to the edge of your bed. That's what I would envision. You create a pocket pond, the frogs will come, the dragonfly, all the things that are helpful to you. It's just a matter of design into the system or maybe on the edge of your system. And that's been an important aspect of permaculture that I'm glad I brought with me. And so the Greywater Pond, even that takes my soap water from the tub and the sink in my tiny house, is one of those. Duckweed is feeds the ducks, but it also is a great transplanting high nitrogen. It's a lovely thing to use for foliar feed if you need a little extra somewhere. I don't really believe in fertilizers. I don't use fertilizers, but maybe my eggplant needs to outgrow flea beetles when I take the cloth off. I just want a little bit of extra boost. Vitamin, like us supplementing. We need to get our health from the soil, right? But ponds can give you a little bit of extra local fertility. I call it duckweed. People use fish emulsion and seaweed, organic people. That doesn't come from around here. And that's the thing about, this system is it's all locally based. So it's quite a bit different than, it's living in a very low money and locally based economy. It's quite different. But I do believe it can be scaled up, and that's why I love what you're doing.
Yeah, and I love the idea of duckweed being our seaweed.
Azolla too, although Azolla's not winter hardy, but that's something that rice paddies can benefit from. I'm looking into maybe putting that in my hoop house and moving that out. But duckweed, I'm gonna try to keep the ducks out of the rice paddy at the beginning so I can build up at least some duckweed.
Right. Can you describe a little bit of your perennial production? I know you have a food forest, and we ate some really amazing pears and persimmons while we were up there visiting, down there visiting, I guess, from here, but up in the mountains. Can you describe a little bit of how you've kind of set that up and how that sort of plays into your marketing and such?
Yeah, so of course the annual production is still somewhat important in including the staple crops, but I tell you, it has definitely transformed over the years from, more annual to this year was amazing with fruit. I mean, literally from April to November, there's something, I had so many berries. I have a really wide diversity of crops, which is kind of fun for CSA and market for people to experiment with. June berries is a little more common, but jujubes or, the different types that, like I have a mandarin peach and heirloom apples aren't so much. My CSA customers understand that I do not spray. I don't even use the organic. So I do make a lot. I have a dehydrator. I dry a lot of fruit. Figs, for example, and the persimmons you tried and the pears, Asian pears do well here. cherries, mulberries. Mulberries are important for the ducks too. Yeah, there's a lot of different stuff, and it's just been lovely to have, some of the nut and fruit trees were the very first things I did when I cleared. I remember macheting before I could have I had somebody come bush hog once I got, trees down, and that was where my orchard is. And yes, I have a food forest. My chestnuts in the I have more American cross chestnuts in the food forest. They're not nearly as productive as my Chinese chestnuts you saw. And I'm replanting more Chinese cross with Americans, though they're more of a pastoral tree. So I imitate natural systems in the permaculture aspect of a food forest by providing the drip line around those trees with what I call passive Hyuga culture. I mean, I have Hyuga culture beds, but this is just, limbs and downed wood from the edge of the forest around that drip line, covered with leaves and raked over, and grass in the summer. Some of the cuttings that when they mow go on that, just to keep that drip line and really build up the soil around that. So it isn't a food forest because, let's face it, a food forest is perfectly happy. It's kind of like my persimmons in my forest. I mean, maybe there's a couple fruit up top, but they're perfectly healthy, perfectly happy, but we want them to produce fruit, don't we? So I've learned a lot from having the food forest and moving gooseberries out that got totally shaded. Gumi berries, I kind of purposely let them be shaded. They're an autumn olive relative there. People say, oh my gosh, that could be invasive, but they got shaded out by the, pecans and the nut trees. So they fixed nitrogen for them. There was a lot of really wonderful things I learned from it. But as far as production and efficiency of harvest, for one thing, that food forest area is on a really steep slope, makes it really hard to harvest some things. And I've done a lot of chop and drop, which you may understand that concept, but I might have bird cherries come up in there, and that's fine because the birds pooped out the seeds and it provided biomass to create, to replicate a real forest where there was once eroded clay. And so there is one tangle of lots and lots of wood and hard to step over and find a chestnut if you wanted to. A pig would do fine. So yeah, I'm really happy to have learned from that. But as far as production and what I've sold, I kind of feel like the orchard and improving the spacing and improving the area underneath those trees has been the most important thing. Another thing is I surround it with pollinating perennials. There's a guy up in Canada, I forget his name because I'm not on the internet, but he has done orchards in a permaculture way. And in the early years when I was I was in New Zealand, there's this place called Coanga Gardens. I learned about the comfrey being a great kind of a barrier crop to keep the grasses out of, like, pears and apple trees just don't compete with grass. They're surface rooted. And so to keep a woody material protected from the grass surrounding it, a comfrey, thick edge of comfrey has been a really important thing. I also make salve, and it's a wonderful medicine. It's healed my broken leg of my dog. Comfrey is amazing. It's a fertilizer. It's so many things, but it also is a great barrier to grass invasion around the trees that you want to have a woody mulch layer under. And I've added wood chips. I've planted strawberries. I actually even planted sweet potatoes in that orchard area when those trees were small, because it was so improved by all the woody material that I initially added. Now I don't have to so much because the trees are big, they're dropping carbon. But yeah, so I really tend to feel that for production, for market, you really have to compromise between the food forest idea and the Mollisonisms, as I like to call them. Bill Mollison really was a great talker, but I feel like there is a lot to learn from food forests, but it's also something that you can take to a productive, to food production. Like like I said, I have hazelnuts that are hard to harvest. I just feel like there's a lot of things I wish I had planted differently. You learn those things over time. I'm planting a lot of chestnut seedlings now from my chestnuts, so I love chestnuts. That's one of my favorite things. I'm experimenting since I have a corn mill or a flour mill. I'm going to make chestnut flour.
So, speaking of, kind of doing things differently, I know that a lot of our listenership is probably within their first 10 years of growing, or maybe just getting ready to grow. Is there anything, as you kind of transition out of annual production, that you kind of wish you'd focused more on?
You mean in annual production, or?
I mean, just maybe in general in terms of management and, it could be in terms of annual production, but it could also just be in terms of setting up your farm or anything like that.
Well, I often say that I started farming for a living too soon, and partly is because of the means that I was basically homesteading, which means I was camping on my land. And so I started even becoming a market farmer before I even had a house finished. And one of the things is that it was all do it yourself, and all the buildings that I've built on the land have been self-built. So that doing that as you know, you don't earn a ton of money with farming, and so to try to make your living also pay for building infrastructure is very difficult. And so the limitations of scaling up are also because of where I am, but one of the issues is whether that's been my transition in the later years, is I have chosen to be a market farmer. I've had lots of apprentices move through this farm, and I'm really happy for all of those years. But I also had an inefficiency of processing and market prep, because I started without any solar electric system, but I'm on a very tiny solar electric system, which precludes anything like a walk-in cooler or a cool bot or anything like that. I do have an efficient freezer. I don't even have a refrigerator. So I freeze ice bottles. I have lots of coolers. CSA and market prep was challenged by that. I look back at the inefficiencies of time in that, and of course there was a lot of learning for apprentices over the years and woofing, and I'm happy for that. But I feel like a lot of that time of preparing for market could have been much more efficient if I was on the grid. So I have chosen. What do you choose? And I've chosen to share what I learned and try to go that direction. I'm doing more consulting now because I want to stay. I guess because my first year in the States or in Kentucky was in the coal mining region, which is where electricity comes from. I was faced with that reality. And I always, even back to my college years, was interested in passive solar. That's what I built, as a passive solar off-grid house. I want to stay that way. And so in my situation, was a decision of which way do you go. And you've gone through that yourself, Jesse. You guys started with Sharon, Eric, and that choice is a hard one. I mean, it's possible to scale way up with a lot of money, and things have become a little bit more economical on the solar end. But in my scale, I feel like that decision to go so many years and with that inefficiency was a lot of work. Efficiency of production is one thing in a tiny space, but efficiency of marketing and processing for what I was trying to do. It is kind of crazy. I mean, people were like amazed. Like, I'm always known for certain things, but also of having all kinds of weird things. I was doing turmeric and ginger before it was a big thing here, and I was doing a lot of things that people had never heard of. Like I've got sunchokes on the market right now. I educate people with that. And I love that part of it, but it also isn't conducive to the kind of scale up of what I needed. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I guess making that decision for somebody new is important. I didn't necessarily think through that decision is how it was going to be for me when I got to be 60. Because I haven't earned a lot of money. I've lived for many years and I've built a farm. And, it's a small peasant mountainside farm, but I haven't, I don't have any 401k for retirement. So I'm counting on my health.
Which is doing well because you've also become an oxen in your 50s. So well, Susana Lein, this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, well, I sure appreciate what you are doing, Jesse, and thank you so much for, I feel like for 20 years I've been crying in the wilderness in a way. I think I said that to you before, and it's just so gratifying to see it out there. And even if I'm not super web connected, I really feel it's the way people are learning, and you're doing it. And thank you for that, because it's so much more than being a farmer, and that is important. I mean, we want to do more than just farming. We want to make change in the world, and you're doing it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And you're doing it as well. Can you shout out a few of your events that you have every year?
Well, now that I have a website done by my friend, they will be on the website. I could give you that link. There's a longer permaculture course in the fall, and I have collaborated with neighbors, and I hope to do another natural building workshop. As you know, I built a tiny house before that was a thing, and I've always wanted to have a mud room and a bigger house. I never even knew what a tiny house was. And I want to do a clay slip straw edition. Something that folks can see on the website is that I do natural building. I have an earthen floor in my house. Came out of the ponds and the rice paddies now. So those things are up in the air as far as when that would be, but I also am doing workshops for other folks that hopefully will be listed on this. Me not having internet makes the website a little bit harder to get, but we are going to this winter get some dates up there, so they can use that as and there's actually even a newsletter. I mean, you can sign up to when, to find out when those workshops are happening.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to check out some of the links Susana mentioned. I'll stick those in the show notes. Also, make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it, on iTunes or Stitcher or CastBox. Review it. That's always cool. Make sure to say something about the theme music. I feel like most people don't forget that part. Also, check out the event in San Diego at no-tillgrowers.com/events and become a patron. Patreon.com/FarmerJesse. You can also kick us a few bucks at Venmo, Venmo. We're at No-Till Growers. You can always reach out if you have other things you want to contribute. Just let me know. You can always reach out to no-tillgrowers@gmail.com and just say, hey, I've got this horse I'd like to give you, and we'll talk about it. We don't really need a horse, but we'll talk about it. Thank you to Josh Satin and Jackson Roulette for their help with no-tillgrowers.com. Thank you to our show sponsors, and an enormous thank you to my wife, Hannah, for all her support. Otherwise, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. We talked about the corn, but like to see the corn that you're actually producing, I think makes such a difference when you're talking about how you're producing it.
Yeah.
So I think it would be cool for us to come down and get some really nice photos of that and maybe a little bit of video. And your granary, I think that's such a cool thing. Yeah.
The PowerPoint slides too are available on the link. That's definitely helpful. Visuals help so much. So yeah, that sounds great.